Why are we doing an incline bench press? Well, that's fantastic for the upper pecs. Why are we doing a wide grip lat pull down or chin up? Oh, that's fantastic for the outer lats and gives you width. How about why are we turning my toes out when I squat? Oh, that's fantastic for stimulating the inner quads. Why are we doing crunches? Oh, it's great for getting ripped abdominals. Or why are we doing the plank? Oh, it's fantastic for the core. And you're going to come across lots of different claims that are attached to lots of exercises and their variations. And you have a right to say, why are we doing this exercise? And what will come out will be a claim or a proposed benefit. And every exercise has a claim or a proposed benefit. However, the better question as an exercise professional is not to necessarily ask the why. Yeah, that's a good starting point. Why are we doing this? Or why do you want me to do this? But the more important question is, how does it work? Because a million people saying something doesn't necessarily mean it's right. I was always taught 5 million people saying a stupid thing doesn't mean it's not a stupid thing. And if you start to question the norm, the normal answer that everyone gives or claims they give to different exercises, then sometimes you become isolated. You become, well, you know, you're the radical, you're questioning it, you're the outcast. But many times those outcasts, if they follow the process and they seek the truth, then they become the next pioneer that everyone rallies behind. So in the Max program, as I shared at the start, I'm not here to teach you what to think or tell you what to think. I'm here to teach you how to think. So it's really important that you learn how to think and question everything, not just the why, but how does it actually work. So in the next few sessions, I'm going to go through different main exercises and their variations and their proposed claims and look at them from a anatomical point of view or biomechanical point of view, sometimes a physiological or biological point of view, which is understanding how does that actually work. Now, many times when you hear a claim, don't just accept the claim. Go back to the process, look at the exercise, then go through the process and see what pops out. Follow the anatomy, follow the physiology. Don't accept the answer, then try to justify the answer. Look at the exercise, follow the process, and that may give you a different answer. And you may say, hey, that actually is different than the claim. However, the claim might be shallow of evidence. It's just what everyone else says. It becomes a rumor that over time, if everyone says it enough, it becomes fact that they start to protect and start to defend through conviction. So today we're going to look at legs and squats. Now, I'm not going to have the chance to go through every exercise that there is in the exercise profession, because as fast as I go through them is as fast as they're making up new variations or new exercise techniques and methods and have new claims attached to them. And I've been doing this now for 38 years in the profession, and they're coming in particular with social media. Everyone wants to attach their fame on a new claim. So let's go through the process of legs. And the main exercise in legs is squats, obviously, and there's variations. There's lunges and there's deadlifts, and there's also the machines such as leg extension. So let's have a look at just some of the common ones, and most important here is not the answer, but understanding the process that I went through to find the answer. So let's have a look at, for example, the leg actions. And first of all, to follow the anatomy, follow the evidence, you have to know the anatomy. That's a good starting point, because if you don't know your anatomy, then you can easily be led down anyone's path, because you have no foundation to go through the process of how does this work. So obviously when you look at the legs, and let's look at the quadriceps, because the claim might be if I poke my toes out, that's going to work my inner quad, and if I bring my toes in, that's going to work my outer quad. And that's maybe the same in the leg extension. So if I do a leg extension, and we already know that a leg extension from previous sessions, that's a contraindicated exercise, because it's going to increase shearing forces across the knee joint, as well as increase patellofemoral compression forces between the patella and the femur that will grind away at the knee. So from a knee integrity point of view, from a safety point of view, then that's not going to be a good exercise to do, because it's increasing unwanted stresses across the femur and the tibia, where the tibia slides forward on the femur, increase shearing forces, and increase the compression of the patella onto the femur through the angle of the leg extension. And that's the main cause of knee injuries, is increased patellofemoral compression. So I'm not going to go into that, because that's not the purpose of this session. What I will go into, however, is the claim of adapting your foot position. That's going to affect the muscle activity in the quadriceps. So let's have a look at the quadriceps. Quad means there's four muscles of the quadricep. First of all, you've got the rectus femoris, which originates on your iliac spine, goes across the knee joint via the patella, falls into the patellar tendon onto the tibia. So that is a biarticulate muscle, goes across the hip joint and the knee joints, responsible for hip flexion and knee extension. The other three are your vastus medialis, which is one sits in the middle, on the side, on the medial side, or the inner side. The vastus intermedius, which is one in the middle. Vastus lateralis, which is on the outside, or the lateral. Now, all those originate on the femur, on the anterior femur. They form with the rectus femoris to form the patellar tendon, across the patella, obviously across the knee joint, and attaches onto the tibio-tuberosity. So all of those four muscles form a common tendon called the patellar tendon. They all attach onto the patella, goes down to the tibio-tuberosity, which is the anterior proximal tibia, and they will cause knee extension. So those three are a single joint muscle. They only go across one joint, where the rectus femoris goes across the hip joint. So it's a biarticulate. So it's important to understand where they position, where they originate, where they insert, and what joints they affect. So let's have a look at, for example, if I'm doing a normal squat, feet parallel. Now if I turn my feet out, right, so I have my feet slightly turned out, what I'm actually doing is, the first question is, when I change an exercise, then I'm going to change a joint position. So the first thing you have to identify is what joint is changing. And when you identify that joint, if I turn my toes out, I'm actually laterally rotating my hip joint. So the joint change is in the hip joint. My feet are basically in the same position. I just rotate them out. So if I'm in this position and I go this, I haven't changed my elbow joint or my wrist joint or my fingers joint. All I'm basically doing is changing my body position. So it's not about changing because my feet positions are the same, my knee positions are the same. The only difference, even though they're the moving part, but they move as a consequence of the change in the hip joint. So my hip joint is actually laterally rotating. So first thing is the hip joint. What it is actually doing? It's laterally rotating. The next question, when you got that change in hip joint position, what muscles does it affect? And it can only affect muscles that go across that joint. If the muscles don't go across that joint, those muscles will be unaffected, because those muscles are the same. Like the muscles in my calves, they're not affected at all by my hip position, because they're down there. They don't even go across the hip joint. So what muscles goes across the hip joint that will be affected? Now the claim is, if you do a toes out, that's going to work your inner quad or your inner quadriceps, which is technically speaking your vastus medialis, which is the inside part. So the question is, does my vastus medialis go across the hip joint? And the answer is no, because the vastus medialis originates on the femur. The only muscle that goes across the hip joint is your rectus femoris, which is not on the medial side anyway. So the question is now, is if I laterally rotate my hip, I'm changing my hip position. It has no effect on your vastus medialis. But the claim says it works your inner quad, which is your vastus medialis. So the answer is, well, how can it work my vastus medialis where that joint position has changed, but it has no effect on the vastus medialis? Now, it may have an effect on other muscles that go across the hip joint. So yes, it could have an effect on your rectus femoris. It could have an effect on your adductors, which is your adductus longus and brevis and magnus on your inner thigh. But we don't talk about that when you look at your inner quadricep. So what's interesting is, if I do a normal squat or I take my toes out squat, the activation of my vastus medialis and my intermedius and my vastus lateralis, which neither of them go across the hip joint, they're going to be completely ineffective, because they only work across the knee joint, not the hip joint. So it's not going to have any effect on the muscle activation of vastus medialis or lateralis or intermedius, because that joint has no relevance, is not even connected to those muscles. Now other muscles may be affected, but those ones are not. Now if I do that on the leg extension, people do that as well. In my old bodybuilding days, when I did all these contraindicated exercises that wore out the joints, which I'm suffering from now, I was taught that if you turn your toes out in the leg extension, you're going to work your vastus medialis more so than your lateralis. And I think that was because of the look principle. The look principle is because when I rotate my toes out, or laterally rotate them, my vastus medialis sits on top and I can see it. So it's the look, it says, oh, I can see it more, so it must be working more. But that was not the case. Even back then, I thought that was true because I was one of those sheeple who followed everyone else in their claims without going through the process of how does that actually work from an anatomical point of view. Because when you go through the anatomical process, it doesn't make any anatomical sense and it has no validation from an anatomy point of view. Now, if I turn my toes in, then is that going to work my outer quad? Well, turning your toes in, all you're doing is medially rotating your hip joint, and therefore does that have an effect in your vastus muscle groups? Of course not, because neither of those muscles, the vastus group, go across the hip joint. The only one that does is your vastus, is your rectus femoris. So what's interesting is if you follow the anatomy, you're going to come out with the right answer, the right claim, the right benefit, the right proposed benefit, and you can justify it from an anatomical point of view rather than say, hey, the biggest guy in the gym told me it's true, so it must be right because he's big. Well, that's not anatomy. That's a big opinion from a big person, but it may have a low level of anatomical sense to it. What's interesting is, if you look at the research on EMG research, there was some research done in the 90s by a researcher, by Signero, got his work published in the Strength and Conditioning Research Journal, which is an internationally recognized peer-reviewed scientific journal. And he looked at this as well, and what he basically did, he plugged up the vastus medialis and lateralis and the rectus femoris to an EMG machine, electromyographical machine that measures muscle activity, electrical activity in the muscle, and he got people to do a 10 RM squat in different knee positions or foot positions, and he also a 10 RM leg extension doing different knee or foot positions. And what he found basically confirms what anatomical process comes up with. And what he discovered is that whether your toes are pointed in or out, it didn't make any difference when it comes to the muscle activation of the vastus lateralis versus the vastus medialis. So it didn't change any focus of muscle activation by changing the hip joint position. So it had no difference whatsoever between the two, whether your feet are out or in when it comes to contribution of your inner quadricep, vastus medialis, or outer quadricep, vastus lateralis. And one didn't activate one more than the other. Obviously, the determining factor would determine the overall muscle activation will be determined by the load that you can lift. So if you lift a heavier load, you're going to generate more force through the muscle, more motor unit recruitment, more muscle activation, more muscular tension. So the muscle activation is determined by the load, not necessarily the angle of the feet. So the message there is then if the load's the most important thing, then put your feet in a position, in their strongest position, most stable position, so you can maximize the load that you can lift, which is going to now maximize the force going through the muscle, maximize the motor unit recruitment, the muscle activation, and the muscular tension. So put your legs in a strong position, where it says you can lift a strong weight to get a stronger result, to get a strong muscle activation. That also take into account, put it in a more functional position, because you see those big sumo squats with your feet are really wide. Yes, you can lift a heavier weight because you don't have to lift it as high. However, that's not necessarily functional anyway, but that's another topic altogether. The other interesting thing with Signero, what he discovered, is doing a 10 RM leg extension versus a 10 RM squat from a muscle activation point of view overall, even though there was no difference between the vastus medialis versus the vastus lateralis. But when you did a 10 RM squat, you got overall a greater muscle activation as compared to doing a leg extension. And the reasoning for that, again, goes back to my previous observation, is that in a squat, you're going to be able to lift a heavier load. Now, yes, you're activating more muscles, but all that load still has to go through the quadriceps through extension of the knee joint. So doing a 10 RM squat, you're going to get greater muscle activation through the quadriceps, medialis and lateralis, no difference depending on foot position, as you would be doing a leg extension. So the question is, why are you doing a leg extension? Well, some people say, well, I can work the inner and outer. Well, we know that's not true, because no matter what angle your feet's at, it's not going to make any difference to activation of your vastus medialis or lateralis, because they don't go across the hip joint, and that's the joint that's changing, not necessarily the knee joint. You're not getting as great a muscle activation overall as compared to doing a squat. So what is the benefit of it? It's not even functional, it's a very dysfunctional position, because you're in a seated position with your hip flex and your back flat and your shoulders are in this kyphotic position, poke neck, rounded shoulder position, with the knee bent in the load at the distal end of your tibia going across the joint. So there's no functional reasoning to do it, as well as you also get those added increases in stresses across the joint in terms of shearing forces, where you activate the agonist and not co-activate the antagonist, the agonist being the quadriceps, the antagonist being the hamstrings, which have a very important role in stabilizing the joint to stop the quadriceps over pulling the tibia that pulls the tibia forward on the femur, and the antagonist's role is to keep that tibia back on the femur to maintain integrity of the joint while you're performing that leg extension exercise. And because your hamstrings are not working, the tibia will tend to increase that sliding of the tibia forward on the femur, causing shearing forces, not to mention in that position where your knee is flexed and the load's at the distal end of the tibia, and the load's not going through the joint, it's going across the joint. That in turn creates a pulling of the patella back onto the femur, increasing patellofemoral compression forces that can lead to the most common knee injury called patellofemoral syndrome, where you get the grinding of the patella, particularly up against the lateral femur, the lateral condyle of the femur. So leg extensions, whether your toes are in or out, makes no difference. You get less muscle activation than doing a squat, and it has a higher potential risk of injury due to the dysfunctional position of it and the biomechanics of the exercise. So when you look at squatting, whether it be toes in, toes out, leg extension versus a squat, at least now you're not just going to believe what people say about the exercise. You're going to have a process to go through to be able to analyze that exercise to see if there's any truth into the claim. But if there is a claim or a proposed benefit, my suggestion when you look at your exercises in the gym, don't ignore, just pretend you don't even know the answer, pretend you don't know the claim, then look at the exercise from an anatomical, biomechanical, physiological point of view, go through the process of how does that work, and then at least you kind of come up with the correct benefit that can be backed up by science, but most importantly anatomy and physiology, and that may be backed up by published research studies such as the research by Signerol, which was done back in the 90s. So it's been around a long time, but obviously people don't read published research studies, therefore they don't really get exposed to the correct answer, or B, they don't know their anatomy and physiology, so they can't work out the right answer, so they just believe what the crowd says. And we know what the crowd says, they just spread rumours like wildfire. And I don't want you to be one of those people, a follower, a sheeple who follows other people's claims. I want you to understand and be able to work out the right answer so you can learn to think for yourself and not be led down the garden path or join the sheep in the sheeple herd running over the cliff or whatever it might be, doing an exercise that doesn't give you the benefit that you think it does, and it can be also potentially dangerous. So when you're looking at exercise, when you look at other exercises in the coming weeks, I'll be looking at the push exercises, flat bench presses and incline bench presses, and close grip and wide grip, and I do the same with chin ups, wide and close, and chin ups versus seated rows. And that will give you the three main movement patterns, which is the push movement pattern, whether it be wide or close or incline or flat or decline. Pulling, whether it be pulling here or pulling above or wide or close. I've already just done the legs, that will give you a good indication there. And you're going to apply these same principles to squats and lunges. I've already done a session on lunges in the past. If you want to have a look at that, from where you're looking at a long stance lunge versus a short stance lunge. And again, I've just applied the same principles of anatomy to that. So when you look at an exercise variation or comparing one exercise to the other, the first thing you have to look at, if there's a change in the variation, then there has to be a change in the joints. So you have to identify what joints are changing. Number two, how are they changing? Are they rotating laterally or medially? Are they flexing? Are they extending? Are they abducting or adducting? So once you identify that, then you say, then how does that change? What muscles go across that joint? So just focus on the muscles go across the joint, because only those muscles will be affected by that change. And number three, if those muscles go forward, the muscles do go across that joint, how does that change those muscles? Does it activate them? Does it stretch them? Does it change them at all? And then if you do that, then you've got a good fundamental process to be able to justify what you're doing. Because as an exercise professional, you always have to, for yourself and your own integrity, be able to justify what you're doing from an anatomical and a physiological point of view, and also be able to justify it for your clients if they ask. Now, most clients won't ask, I understand that, and they trust that you know, but the question is, do you really know? But more importantly, do you really understand from an anatomy and a physiological point of view? Because that's pretty much the game we are as exercise professionals. We get people to exercise. And when you get people to exercise, that involves the skeletal system, the muscular system, the nervous system, and well as the hormonal system. So basically we use these systems to trigger physiological changes to benefit our client. But if you don't understand those systems, then you're really guessing. And if you don't really understand that, you're guessing or you're just following. So don't guess, don't follow, become a leader and think for yourself. See you in the next Kman.